An ancient capital fell, and warfare changed forever. The siege of Nineveh in 612 BCE was not merely the destruction of a city, it was a military revolution that shattered old doctrines and forged new ones. The principles of strategy proven on its plains would be studied for millennia, from the legions of Rome to the command centers of today. By the end of this story, you will understand how a single battle rewrote the entire playbook of conquest, creating tactics that still shape modern conflicts. How did a coalition of rivals topple a seemingly invincible empire, and what was the fatal flaw in its legendary defenses? What do you believe is the most powerful weapon in any army's arsenal? Ingenuity or sheer force? The sheer scale of the Neo-Assyrian Empire is almost difficult to comprehend. For nearly 300 years, it was the dominant force in the known world, its control extending from the turquoise waters of the Nile to the shimmering heat of the Persian Gulf. This was not a kingdom built on gentle persuasion. Its foundation was an army of terrifying efficiency, a force that combined the cutting-edge technology of iron weaponry with a brutal doctrine of psychological warfare. When Assyrian troops marched, they did so with a singular purpose: to crush resistance so utterly that the very idea of rebellion would die with the defeated. They were the masters of siegecraft, of disciplined infantry formations, and of a message carved into stone for all to see: cross us, and you will be erased. At the heart of this military machine lay its capital, Nineveh. This was no ordinary city. It was a sprawling metropolis of breathtaking wealth and sophistication, a testament to imperial power. Its walls were legendary, colossal structures of stone and brick so thick that chariots could race along their tops. They were punctuated by 15 majestic gates, each a fortress in its own right. Within these defenses lay lush botanical gardens, a complex system of aqueducts bringing fresh water, and palaces filled with treasures and art from a dozen conquered nations. The great library of King Ashurbanipal housed thousands of clay tablets, gathering the knowledge of Mesopotamia under one roof. This empire was a master of administration and logistics, weaving conquered territories into a cohesive whole through deportations, resettlement, and a network of swift messengers and well-guarded roads. Assyria did not just win battles, it built a system of control that became the blueprint for every empire that followed. Its apparent invincibility is precisely what makes its impending fall so cataclysmic. How could such a leviathan, seemingly armored in stone and steel, be brought to its knees so suddenly? The answer lies not in a single weakness, but in a perfect storm of rising enemies and a fatal miscalculation at the very top. Yet even the mightiest fortress can crumble from within. The Assyrian Empire, for all its terrifying power, had sown the seeds of its own destruction across 3 centuries of relentless conquest. Its iron-fisted rule left a trail of smoldering cities and bitter resentment, a debt that was about to be called in by a chorus of vengeful voices. The old order was fracturing, and from its cracks emerged a dangerous new alliance. From the south rose the Babylonians, a civilization with a history as deep as Mesopotamia itself. For generations they had chafed under Assyrian domination, their own kings mere puppets. But now they found a leader of iron will in Nabopolassar, a man who envisioned a new Babylonian empire and would stop at nothing to break the chains binding his people. His was not a simple revolt, it was a crusade to reclaim a lost crown. From the rugged highlands to the east came the Medes, a hardened confederation of tribes whose warriors were as tough as the mountain terrain they called home. They brought with them a different kind of warfare, one built on mobility and ferocity, and a burning desire to carve out their own kingdom free from Assyrian tribute and interference. And in a move that would have been unthinkable in an earlier age, even the nomadic Scythians joined this grand coalition. These master horsemen from the northern steppes were the wild card, their hit-and-run tactics and deadly accuracy with the composite bow adding a fluid, unpredictable element to the coming conflict. This was not a temporary pact of convenience. It was a strategic masterpiece, a deliberate fusion of disparate military strengths designed to attack the Assyrian colossus from every angle. The Babylonians brought organized infantry and deep knowledge of Assyrian tactics. The Medes contributed their rugged close-quarters fighters and knowledge of the eastern frontiers. The Scythians offered a swirling cloud of cavalry that could harass, disrupt, and vanish. Together, they embodied a revolutionary idea in ancient geopolitics, that unity among rivals could achieve what solitary rebellion never could. The storm was no longer gathering, it was on the march, and its target was the very heart of the empire. But the grand alliance of enemies was only one part of the equation. Inside its own borders, the Assyrian Empire was beginning to crack under the weight of its own success. Decades of constant, expensive warfare had drained the imperial treasury dry. Funding a massive professional army and maintaining those legendary fortifications across a continent was a colossal financial burden. The very military machine that built the empire was now bankrupting it, stretching its resources to a breaking point. At the same time, the political landscape was shifting dangerously. The era of strong, decisive kings like Ashurbanipal was over, replaced by a series of weaker rulers who could not command the same fear or loyalty. The royal court in Nineveh became a hotbed of intrigue and conspiracy, with powerful factions vying for influence and sapping the strength of the central authority. The empire's command structure, once a model of efficiency, was now riddled with indecision. To make matters worse, nature itself seemed to turn against them. Scientific analysis of ancient climate data points to a period of severe drought during these critical years. Crop yields would have plummeted, leading to food shortages and rising prices. A hungry population is a restless one, and social unrest likely simmered in the very heartland of the empire, further straining the loyalty of the people. The empire's greatest asset, its immense size, had now become its most critical vulnerability. Supply lines stretching for thousands of miles were fragile threads, easily severed by raiders or rebellious governors. Those provincial governors, once loyal servants of the king, now sensed the weakening grip from the center and began to act with growing autonomy, looking after their own interests first. The mighty Assyrian Empire was not struck down by a single mighty blow. It was being slowly hollowed out, its foundations weakened by economic strain, political decay, and environmental stress. The coalition armies marching toward Nineveh were not just attacking a fortress, they were pushing on a structure already teetering on the brink of collapse from within. The walls of Nineveh were more than just barriers, they were a declaration. They proclaimed that this city was untouchable, a pinnacle of military engineering designed to make any attacker's heart sink. Primary inner wall snaked for over 12 kilometers around the metropolis, a colossal ribbon of mud brick and stone so immense that its sheer height made the idea of climbing it seem ludicrous. This was not a single line of defense, but a layered system of calculated obstacles. An outer wall stood as a first line of resistance, and before it lay a network of moats, their waters channeled from the nearby Kosa River. An advancing army would first have to cross this watery ditch under a hail of projectiles, then breach the outer wall, only to find themselves staring up at the truly monstrous inner fortification. And these walls were alive with defensive purpose. Stone towers studded their length, providing elevated platforms for archers and slingers to rain fire down on any foe. The tops of the ramparts were not narrow walkways. They were wide enough for soldiers and even chariots to rush to a crisis point, allowing the defenders to concentrate their strength wherever the enemy attacked. This was a fortress designed to outlast any foe. Vast granaries were filled with stockpiled grain, and massive reservoirs within the city ensured a continuous supply of fresh water. A conventional siege, where an army simply camped outside and waited for starvation to do its work, was a losing strategy against Nineveh. The city could hold out for years. So how do you conquer the unconquerable? The coalition armies understood that a direct assault was suicide. Their only path to victory lay not in testing the wall's strength, but in exploiting a single critical vulnerability the Assyrian engineers may have overlooked. That single critical vulnerability was not in the stone, but in the command. The fate of Nineveh would be decided by a stark clash of leadership styles, pitting tradition against innovation in the minds of the generals. Inside the besieged city, King Sinsharishkun stood as the last defender of an ancient dynasty. His was a position of immense pressure, bearing the weight of 300 years of imperial history. He likely trusted in the old doctrines, the same defensive playbook that had kept his ancestors safe within these legendary walls. His command structure was rigid and hierarchical, a top-down system where orders flowed from the king downward. This approach had built the empire, but could it save it from an unprecedented crisis? Across the field, the Allied command presented a radical alternative. This was not a single supreme leader, but a partnership. On one side stood Nabopolassar of Babylon, a master of political strategy who had spent years patiently building his rebellion. He understood the inner workings of the Assyrian system, its logistical weaknesses and its political fractures. His partner was Siegecraft, the Median king, a hardened warlord from the mountains whose entire life had been a lesson in mobile, opportunistic warfare. Together, they embodied a new model of command. Their war council was a collaborative space where Babylonian siegecraft and knowledge of the terrain could merge with Median ferocity and cavalry tactics. This fusion of minds allowed for a level of strategic flexibility that the rigid Assyrian hierarchy could not match. Where Sinsharishkun was bound by tradition, the allies were free to innovate, to adapt, to synthesize the best ideas from different military traditions into a single winning formula. The siege, therefore, became more than a test of walls. It was a test of two opposing philosophies of power. One looked to the past for its answers, while the other was inventing a blueprint for the future. The first clash at the gates of Nineveh was a brutal lesson in reality. Coalition soldiers surged forward, their shields locked, only to be met by a storm of arrows and heavy stones crashing down from the towering battlements. The great gates, reinforced with bands of metal, held firm against their battering rams. Each failed assault reinforced a simple, terrifying truth: the direct approach was a pathway to annihilation. The city's defenses were every bit as formidable as their reputation promised, so the attackers shifted their strategy. Instead of a grand, decisive charge, they began a methodical encirclement, tightening a noose around the entire metropolis. Cavalry patrols swept the surrounding countryside, intercepting supply caravans and cutting the communication lines that connected Nineveh to the rest of the empire. The goal was to turn the city's greatest strength, its self-sufficient design, into a prison. Inside, the granaries were full and the reservoirs held water, but the psychological impact of complete isolation began to weigh heavily on the defenders. The Allies also engaged in a cunning game of misdirection. They would launch a furious, noisy assault on one of the northern gates, drawing the elite guard to that sector, only to have a smaller, more mobile force test the defenses at a southern wall hours later. These were not attempts to breach the walls, but to probe for softness, to identify a commander who was less vigilant, or a section of the ramparts that was less frequently patrolled. This phase of the siege was a grim war of attrition and intelligence gathering. The coalition was learning the daily rhythms of the city's defense, its patterns and its potential blind spots, all while slowly draining the morale of those trapped inside. For weeks, this frustrating stalemate held. The Allies had successfully contained the Assyrian lion in its den, but they had no way to slay it. A new, radical plan was needed, one that could bypass those impossible walls entirely. The relentless thud of the battering ram became the soundtrack of the siege's turning point. Faced with those impervious walls, the coalition realized that patience alone would not win the day. They had to build a key to the city. Their answer was a terrifying new application of force, the coordinated use of massive siege engines. These were not just crude logs carried by a few soldiers. They were sophisticated machines of war, the tanks of the ancient world. The Allies constructed towering wooden frames on wheels, moving castles that could be rolled right up to the fortifications. From their high platforms, archers could now look the Assyrian defenders in the eye, raining down arrows to clear the ramparts and provide cover for the assault teams below. The most fearsome of these engines was the protected battering ram. This was a colossal timber, often tipped with a hardened metal head, suspended by ropes or chains within a sturdy wooden shed mounted on wheels. The entire structure was covered in thick, water-soaked animal hides to protect it from flaming arrows. Inside this mobile bunker, teams of soldiers would swing the great ram back and forth, driving its metal head against the city's gates or a chosen weak point in the stonework with methodical, shattering force. The psychological impact of this machine was as devastating as its physical blows. For the defenders, the sight of these slow, unstoppable beasts creeping toward their walls was a nightmare made real. The constant, thunderous boom of metal on wood and stone was a form of torture, a reminder that their greatest advantage was being systematically dismantled. The Allies were not just using technology, they were using it with a new level of coordination. They concentrated multiple rams and towers against a single section of the wall, refusing to let the defenders rest. While one team battered a gate, another would be assaulting a nearby tower, forcing the Assyrians to split their forces and creating openings. This was a revolutionary shift in thinking. It moved warfare from the passive act of a blockade to the active science of demolition. The success of these engines sent a message that would echo through every fortress city for centuries to come, that human ingenuity could, with enough determination, find a way to break any wall. But the thunder of the rams was only one part of the symphony of destruction. When the sheer force of the battering engines met its limit against the most stubborn sections of wall, the coalition unveiled its second masterstroke, a quiet, underground war fought in the dark. While chaos reigned above, teams of specialized soldiers known as Sappers began their secret work. These were not ordinary infantry, they were skilled miners and engineers, masters of a terrifying new science. Their mission was to literally pull the ground out from under the Assyrian defenses. They would dig narrow, shored-up tunnels from their own lines, burrowing deep beneath the massive stone foundations of the city's walls. This was work of immense danger and precision. It required not just brute strength, but a sophisticated understanding of geology and structural engineering. The sappers had to know exactly how much earth to remove and where to place their wooden supports to control the collapse, all while avoiding a catastrophic cave-in that would bury them alive. When the tunnel was complete, they would fill the chamber with combustible material, set it ablaze and retreat. As the supporting timbers burned away, the foundation above would crumble, and a whole section of the seemingly impregnable wall would buckle and crash down in a cloud of dust and rubble, creating a brutal, man-made breach. At the same time, another colossal engineering project was taking shape under the open sky. Where they could not go under, the Allies decided to go over. Thousands of laborers and soldiers began constructing massive earthen ramps, great sloping mountains of packed earth, stone, and timber that were slowly, inexorably pushed toward the city's defenses. This was a siege ramp, and its purpose was simple yet revolutionary: to erase the advantage of height. It turned the defenders' greatest asset into a liability. Suddenly, the towering walls were no longer a barrier, but a slope to be climbed. Siege towers and assault troops could now roll and march directly up to the battlements, turning a vertical assault into a manageable incline. This demonstrated a profound shift in military thinking. Victory was no longer just about overpowering your enemy, but about intellectually and physically reshaping the battlefield to suit your own needs. The coalition was not just attacking a city, it was re-engineering the very landscape of the war. Yet the most powerful weapon deployed at Nineveh made no sound at all. Beyond the shattering rams and the collapsing tunnels, the Allies waged a silent, insidious war for the minds of the defenders. They understood that a city's walls are only as strong as the will of the people defending them. Their strategy evolved into a masterclass in psychological pressure, turning the Assyrian Empire's own favorite tool, terror, back upon its creators. Imagine the whispers circulating within the besieged city, rumors passed in shadowed alleys and crowded barracks. These were not random gossip, they were deliberate acts of propaganda. Stories would spread of other great Assyrian cities falling to the coalition, of armies destroyed and kings captured. The goal was to create a chilling sense of isolation, to convince every soldier and citizen that Nineveh was the last flickering ember of a dying empire, utterly alone in the world. Alongside these tales of doom came promises, subtle offers of mercy for those who laid down their arms or opened a gate. This created a dangerous rift in loyalty, pitting the desperate populace and lower-ranking soldiers against their own leaders. Why die for a lost cause when survival was being offered just beyond the walls? The visual and auditory assault was constant and overwhelming. From the ramparts, the defenders would gaze out not upon a single enemy banner, but a vast, diverse host of their former subjects, all united in a single purpose: their destruction. The Medes, the Babylonians, the Scythians, a living tapestry of vengeance. The air was never silent, filled day and night with the relentless hammering of siege works, the shouts of soldiers, and the creak of moving engines. This was not the orderly cadence of a typical battle. It was a form of sonic torture designed to fray nerves and shatter sleep. The Assyrians had built their empire on a foundation of fear, but they were unprepared for the sheer, grinding anxiety of being on the receiving end. This psychological campaign aimed to do more than just demoralize, it sought to paralyze. A terrified soldier is an ineffective one, his aim less true, his vigilance weakened. More dangerously, this atmosphere of despair and betrayal could ignite a spark of internal rebellion. A disgruntled noble, a frightened merchant, or a desperate soldier could become the instrument of the city's downfall, opening a gate from the inside. The coalition was not just breaking down stone, it was breaking down the human spirit. In that moment, the mental battlefield was formally established as a decisive theater of war, a lesson in the totality of conflict that every future conqueror, from Alexander to the generals of the modern era, would study and refine. The true genius of the Nineveh campaign was not in any single weapon, but in the masterful orchestration of many. The coalition did not merely bring separate armies to the field, they wove them into a single, multi-talented force. This was a revolutionary application of combined arms warfare, where each ally contributed a unique and complementary skill set to create a whole far greater than the sum of its parts. The Medes, hardened by mountain life, provided swift, rugged cavalry. These horsemen were the eyes and swift fists of the army, perfect for scouting far ahead, screening the main force from enemy patrols, and launching sudden, harassing attacks to keep the Assyrian defenders off balance. When the great siege engines were rolled forward, it was the heavily armed Babylonian infantry who formed the shield wall around them. These disciplined foot soldiers, armed with long spears and large shields, were the anvil, holding the line against any Assyrian countercharge that tried to destroy the precious battering rams. And then there were the Scythians, the wild cards from the steppes. Their contribution was a swirling, unpredictable cloud of horse archers, capable of unleashing a storm of arrows from a distance and then vanishing before a return volley could be organized. This synergy created a battlefield organism that could adapt to any threat. While Babylonian infantry protected the sappers digging their tunnels, Median cavalry guarded the flanks from relief forces, and Scythian skirmishers peppered the ramparts to suppress enemy archers. This fluid cooperation stood in stark contrast to the Assyrian war machine. The Assyrian army was a masterpiece of discipline and uniformity, but it was built to fight in a certain predictable way. It was a powerful, rigid hammer. The coalition, however, was an entire toolkit. Their victory proved a profound new principle in military science, that flexibility and interoperability could overwhelm even the technological and numerical advantages of a single superpower. The fall of Nineveh established a timeless blueprint, showing that the most decisive victories often belong not to the strongest army, but to the most harmonious alliance. While the coalition's warriors hammered at the walls, an invisible army was at work far from the front lines. The true test of the siege was not just breaking the gates, but feeding the immense force tasked with breaking them. An army of tens of thousands, along with their horses and laborers, consumed a mountain of grain and a river of water every single day. This presented a logistical puzzle of epic proportions, one that would make or break the entire campaign. The Allies could not simply live off the land around Nineveh, as the surrounding countryside would be stripped bare in weeks. Their solution was a masterpiece of foresight and organization, a hidden revolution in military supply. They established a network of protected supply routes stretching back to their homelands and to friendly territories. Convoys of ox-drawn carts, guarded by detachments of cavalry, became the lifeblood of the siege, a constant stream of provisions moving along predetermined and secured paths. They also sent out organized foraging parties, not as random bands of plunderers, but as disciplined units with specific quotas, systematically gathering food from a wide area to avoid local famine. Some historians suggest they even pre-positioned massive stores of grain and tools in captured Assyrian towns, turning the empire's own infrastructure against it, creating a chain of depots that shortened the supply line. This relentless focus on logistics represented a fundamental shift in military thinking. For the first time on such a scale, a general had to be as much an accountant and a quartermaster as a battlefield commander. He had to calculate consumption rates, plan for seasonal changes, and secure lines of communication that stretched for hundreds of miles. The ability to sustain a siege for months, keeping an army healthy, supplied, and motivated, was now understood as the foundation of any victory. The fall of Nineveh proved a brutal new equation that long-term campaigns were won not by the sharpest sword alone, but by the most reliable breadbasket. This lesson would echo through the ages, from the well-stocked legions of Rome to the global supply chains of modern warfare. establishing that an army truly marches on its stomach. The thunderous crack of collapsing stone signaled the end of an era. After months of relentless pressure, a section of Nineveh's legendary wall, perhaps undermined by a sapper's tunnel or shattered by a relentless battering ram, finally gave way. The impossible had happened. The breach was not a wide open field but a deadly funnel, a choke point of chaos and carnage, and into this gap poured the coalition's vengeance. This was the moment their revolutionary tactics converged into a single, unstoppable tide. The disciplined Babylonian infantry surged forward, their shields locked to secure the crumbling edges of the breach. Behind them came the ferocious Medes, their close-quarters fighting skills perfect for the brutal alley-by-alley combat that awaited. And all around, Scythian horse archers would have provided covering fire, their arrows finding targets in the panicked ranks of defenders rushing to plug the hole. The Assyrians, trained for set-piece battles and defending high walls, were suddenly forced into a desperate, confined melee where the Allies' diversity of forces became an overwhelming advantage. The very walls designed to protect them now trapped them, channeling the invaders directly into the heart of the city. This was the ultimate demonstration of a new military truth, that a static defense, no matter how formidable, is always vulnerable to a dynamic, multi-pronged offense. The moment that dust cloud rose over the broken rampart, the fate of the Assyrian Empire was sealed. The ancient world did indeed hold its breath, witnessing the fall of a giant, not to a simple show of force, but to a symphony of calculated destruction. The dust had not even settled before the real fight began. The broken wall was not a finish line, it was a new, more terrifying battlefield. The wide plains and ordered ranks of traditional warfare vanished, replaced by a claustrophobic maze of narrow streets, towering temples, and fortified palaces. Every shadowy alley, every rooftop, every doorway could conceal a desperate Assyrian soldier or a citizen defending their home. This was urban combat, a brutal, chaotic form of fighting that was alien to the warfare of the ancient world. It was a battle of inches, not miles, where the grand strategies of the field gave way to the raw instinct for survival. The Assyrians, masters of open field formations and wall defense, were now forced into a fight for which they had no playbook, turning their own magnificent city into a sprawling death trap. Yet the coalition was ready. Their diverse army proved perfectly suited for this grim new phase. Lightly armed Median and Scythian warriors, agile and swift, became the hunters in the tangled streets, flushing out defenders from narrow passages where heavy armor was a death sentence. Meanwhile, the disciplined Babylonian infantry, their large shields locked together, became an unstoppable wall of metal and muscle, methodically storming barricaded buildings and palace gates. This was the final, brutal application of their combined arms strategy, proving that victory required a plan not just for breaking the shell, but for consuming the core. The systematic reduction of Nineveh was a lesson in totality. It demonstrated that conquering a great city meant being prepared to fight for every last stone, to extinguish resistance not just at the gates, but in its very heart. When the last stronghold fell and the fires began to spread, the Neo-Assyrian Empire did not merely surrender, it was physically and symbolically erased from the earth. The shockwave of its collapse rippled across the known world, from the courts of Egypt to the fledgling city-states of Greece. The message was chillingly clear: no walls, no matter how high, could guarantee safety anymore. The fall of Nineveh had rewritten the rules, and every fortified city now had to wonder, what new nightmare would its enemies dream up next? The silence that followed the final battle was more terrifying than the roar of combat. With the last defenders subdued, the victors began their grim, methodical work. This was not a spontaneous frenzy of plunder, but a calculated campaign of erasure. The coalition understood that to truly kill an empire, you had to annihilate its memory. They moved through the grand avenues and opulent palaces with a chilling purpose, systematically dismantling 3 centuries of accumulated power. Gold and silver, the lifeblood of imperial tribute, were stripped from the walls of the royal treasuries. Exquisite furniture, ivory carvings, and jewels gathered from a dozen nations were loaded onto carts bound for Babylon and the Median highlands. This was more than simple theft. It was the redistribution of an empire's wealth, a transfer of power made terrifyingly visible. The very objects that had symbolized Assyrian dominance were now being carried away as trophies by its former subjects. Yet the destruction of treasure was only the beginning. The true target was the soul of the empire. The great palace of Sennacherib, a marvel of engineering and art, was set ablaze. Its towering cedar beams, once fragrant with incense, now sent black smoke billowing into the sky, a funeral pyre for the Assyrian dynasty. Temples dedicated to the gods Ashur and Ishtar were violently entered, their sacred statues defiled or smashed. This was a profound and deliberate sacrilege, a message to the world that the gods of Assyria had abandoned their people, that their divine mandate to rule was irrevocably broken. Perhaps the most catastrophic loss was the assault on knowledge. The great library of Ashurbanipal, a repository of thousands of clay tablets containing the myths, medicines, and star charts of Mesopotamia, was thrown into chaos. While some of these precious texts survived, buried under the debris, the vast majority were scattered, broken, or lost forever. This was an attack on history itself, an attempt to sever the future from the Assyrian past. The Allies were not just conquering a city, they were scouring its identity from the earth. The completeness of this destruction sent a seismic shock through the ancient world. Rival kings from Egypt to Anatolia heard the reports and understood the new, brutal standard for total victory. In the ashes of Nineveh, a new principle of warfare was forged, one where the ultimate victory was not just over an army, but over history itself. The collapse of Nineveh did not end with the last embers of its burning palaces. It triggered a geopolitical earthquake, shattering the Assyrian Empire into fragments and instantly redrawing the map of the ancient world. The centralized power that had dominated the Near East for 3 centuries simply vanished, leaving a vast vacuum. Almost overnight, the western provinces, long held in check by Assyrian garrisons, broke away, their governors and local rulers suddenly free to pursue their own destinies. Into this power void surged the victors. From the ashes, the Neo-Babylonian Empire rose with breathtaking speed under Nabopolassar and his legendary son, Nebuchadnezzar II. They seized control of the fertile Mesopotamian heartland, transforming Babylon from a rebel city into the dazzling capital of the next regional hegemon, its hanging gardens and towering ziggurats becoming symbols of a new golden age. Simultaneously, to the east, the Medes solidified their hold on the sprawling Iranian plateau. They unified the tribes and established a powerful, organized kingdom, one that would soon provide the foundational core for the vast Persian Empire. This was not a return to the old order, but the birth of an entirely new one. The world shifted from a single, overwhelming superpower to a bipolar balance between Babylon in the west and the rising Median, and later Persian, power in the east. This new dynamic would define international relations, trade, and conflict for the next century. The fall of Nineveh delivered a stark lesson to every ruler who followed, a lesson written in fire and blood that no empire, no matter how deeply entrenched, is permanent. It proved that the political landscape was always malleable, and that the destruction of one giant could open the door for new cultures, new ideas, and entirely new systems of power to flourish on the world stage. Yet the story of Assyria is not one of pure erasure. Even as its palaces crumbled, the empire's immense legacy refused to die. Its conquerors, having witnessed the awesome efficiency of the Assyrian war machine and its administrative systems, became its most eager students. The Babylonians, now masters of the region, did not dismantle this complex inheritance, they absorbed it. They adopted and refined Assyrian siege technology, turning the empire's own inventions into the very tools that had sealed its fate. They continued to use Assyrian legal codes, architectural principles, and bureaucratic methods, weaving the threads of their vanquished foes' genius into the fabric of their own rising civilization. The blueprint for empire that Assyria had perfected, with its standardized weights and measures, its network of roads, and its system of provincial governance, became the essential model for every major power that followed, from Babylon to Persia and beyond. The victors, in a profound historical irony, ensured that the Assyrian way of organizing the world would outlive the Assyrian state itself. This cultural absorption was so complete that for centuries, the physical remains of the empire lay buried and forgotten, its cities reduced to anonymous mounds in the Iraqi desert. Then, in the 19th century, a series of dramatic archaeological excavations began to peel back the earth. At sites like Nineveh and Nimrud, explorers uncovered the colossal, human-headed winged bulls that had once guarded the palace gates. They excavated the ruins of Ashurbanipal's great library, where thousands of fire-hardened clay tablets lay preserved in the rubble that had entombed them. These were not just lists of kings and battles, they were textbooks on mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, detailed records of celestial observations, and the epic poem of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature. The stone reliefs that line the palace walls, once intended as imperial propaganda, became a stunningly detailed photo album of ancient life, depicting everything from lion hunts to the intricate process of transporting colossal timber. Through these silent stones and inscribed tablets, the Assyrians themselves began to speak across the millennia, forcing a reassessment of a civilization we had only known through the fearful accounts of its enemies. They reveal a society of immense sophistication and learning, a culture that, for all its famed brutality, was also a cradle of science and governance. The fall of Nineveh was therefore not an ending but a metamorphosis. The Assyrian Empire was broken as a political entity, but its innovations, its knowledge, and its very model of power were assimilated, becoming the hidden foundations upon which future ages were built. The wealth that once adorned the palaces of Nineveh now flowed into the coffers of Babylon, igniting a cultural and military explosion that reshaped the ancient world. With the Assyrian giant toppled, King Nebuchadnezzar II unleashed an unprecedented wave of construction, transforming his capital into a dazzling testament to this new power. The city became a canvas for imperial ambition, its most famous stroke being the legendary Ishtar Gate. This was not merely an entrance, it was a statement of divine favor and unassailable strength, a towering structure of vibrant blue glazed bricks adorned with reliefs of dragons and bulls in shimmering gold. Processions through this gate were a sensory overload of color and symbolism, designed to awe both citizen and foreign envoy alike. And then there were the Hanging Gardens, a marvel of engineering so breathtaking that they would be remembered for millennia as one of the 7 wonders of the world. Though their exact location is debated by historians, ancient accounts describe a magnificent terraced structure, an artificial mountain of lush vegetation and exotic trees rising high above the flat Mesopotamian plain. This was more than a royal pleasure garden. It was a display of ultimate control over nature itself, a symbol that the new Babylonian kings could create paradise on earth through sheer will and technological prowess. This architectural renaissance, funded by the spoils of Nineveh, was the ultimate propaganda, broadcasting that a new, even more magnificent hegemon now ruled. But this golden age was not built by bricks and gardens alone. Its foundation was the hardened steel of a military machine forged in the fires of the previous war. The Babylonians had been keen students at the siege of Nineveh, and they took the revolutionary tactics they witnessed and perfected them. They embraced the combined arms approach, seamlessly integrating their own disciplined infantry with allied cavalry and chariots. More importantly, they mastered the art of siege warfare. When the kingdom of Judah rebelled, the Babylonian response was swift and brutal, a direct application of the lessons learned from their greatest victory. They laid siege to Jerusalem not with a simple blockade, but with the full, terrifying toolkit of modern warfare. They built siege ramps to scale the city's walls, employed battering rams against its gates, and tightened a stranglehold on its supply line. The city, much like Nineveh before it, eventually fell, its temple plundered and its elite carried into exile. This conquest demonstrated a profound and cyclical truth. The very techniques used to dismantle one empire were now being deployed to build and maintain another. Military innovation, it seemed, was a weapon that could be captured and turned against its next victim. This era was not solely defined by conquest and construction. The stability and immense wealth of the Neo-Babylonian Empire fostered a remarkable flourishing of the mind. Babylon became the new intellectual capital of Mesopotamia, a magnet for scholars, astronomers, and scribes. Its astronomers meticulously charted the movements of planets and stars, laying the groundwork for the zodiac and making astonishingly accurate celestial predictions. Legal codes were refined and administered with an efficiency that echoed and even improved upon Assyrian models. Scribes preserved and expanded upon the vast literary tradition of the region, ensuring that the stories and knowledge of ancient Mesopotamia would endure. The confidence gained from toppling Assyria had given the Babylonians more than just an empire, it had given them a vision. They used their resources not only to dominate, but to create a legacy of such splendor and sophistication that the world would never forget their name. In doing so, they proved that the spoils of war could fund the pinnacle of peace, and that the same ingenuity that destroys can also be channeled to build wonders that echo through the ages. The echoes of Nineveh's collapse did not fade in the Mesopotamian dust. They traveled east into the heart of the rising Persian Empire. The Medes, who had helped orchestrate the Assyrian downfall, passed the torch of this new military science to their Persian successors, who became its most brilliant and ambitious students. Under the legendary Cyrus the Great, the principles proven at Nineveh were not merely copied, they were refined into a sophisticated, institutionalized doctrine of conquest. The Persian army became the ancient world's first truly professional, multi-ethnic force, a sprawling machine of war powered by the revolutionary ideas born from that earlier siege. Cyrus understood that to build an empire larger than any before, he needed more than brave warriors, he needed a system. He needed the relentless logic of combined arms, the unbreakable chain of logistics, and the patient, terrifying science of military engineering. This was no longer just an army, it was a living, breathing embodiment of the lessons learned from a fallen giant. The revolution had found its ultimate architect. Consider the sheer audacity of Cyrus' most famous victory. When the mighty city of Babylon defied him, its walls were considered just as impregnable as Nineveh's had once been. A direct assault would have been a bloody folly. So Cyrus did not attack the walls, he attacked the river. His engineers masterfully diverted the flow of the Euphrates, lowering the water level that ran beneath the city's monumental gates. While the Babylonians feasted at a festival, confident in their defenses, Persian special forces waded through the shallows of the riverbed, slipped into the city through the now unguarded water gates, and opened the way for the main army. It was a maneuver of breathtaking ingenuity, a direct spiritual descendant of the Sappers who had tunneled under Nineveh's foundations. It proved that the greatest weapon in any siege was not a battering ram, but a creative mind that could see the battlefield in ways no one else could imagine. This intellectual approach to war became the backbone of the entire Persian military system. They built and maintained the Royal Road, a marvel of ancient logistics that stretched over 1,600 miles, complete with relay stations and fresh horses. This allowed messages to travel with unprecedented speed and, more importantly, enabled the army to be supplied consistently across distances that would have crippled any other force. The Persians standardized the use of siege towers, battering rams, and mobile bridges, turning the ad hoc innovations of the Nineveh coalition into standard-issue equipment for their professional corps of engineers. They perfected the art of psychological warfare, often offering generous terms of surrender before a single arrow was loosed, knowing that a city that surrendered willingly was more valuable than one shattered by storm. Why waste resources on a costly siege when the mere reputation of your army's capabilities could compel a city to open its gates? The Persian Empire thus stands as the ultimate testament to the battlefield revolution that began at Nineveh. They took a spark of tactical genius and fanned it into a stable, enduring flame. By institutionalizing combined arms, logistics, and engineering, they built a war machine of unparalleled flexibility and reach, capable of projecting power from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean Sea. The fall of one empire provided the essential blueprint for the creation of an even greater one. The Persian military doctrine, refined and scaled to a global level, became the new gold standard, a system so effective that even its greatest enemies, like the Greeks, would be forced to study it, adapt to it, and ultimately find a way to break it. The art of war had been permanently transformed. The very doctrines that toppled Nineveh soon marched west, carried by traders, scholars, and the bitter experiences of war. In the sun-baked hills of Greece, a new kind of military thinking was taking root, one that would absorb and refine these Eastern innovations. The Greeks, for centuries, had favored the heroic clash of hoplite phalanxes on open ground. But the long, grueling Peloponnesian War shattered this tradition, forcing them to become masters of a darker art, the science of siegecraft. They began constructing elaborate counterwalls to blockade cities like Plataea and Potidaea, and their engineers built massive wheeled siege towers, some coated in fire-resistant clay, to assault fortified positions. This was a fundamental shift, an admission that a wall was no longer an absolute barrier, but a complex problem to be solved with geometry, physics, and relentless patience. The Greeks were learning to fight not just with muscle, but with their minds, applying the hard-won lessons of a distant Mesopotamian collapse to their own internecine conflicts. No one embodied this fusion of intellect and force more completely than Alexander the Great. He was the ultimate inheritor of the Nineveh playbook, a student of war who understood that victory required a symphony of different elements working in perfect concert. His army was a living example of combined arms, where the unbreakable Macedonian phalanx served as the anvil, and his devastating companion cavalry acted as the hammer. But Alexander's true genius lay in his application of military engineering and psychological pressure. At the seemingly impregnable island city of Tyre, he did not attempt a futile naval assault. Instead, he ordered his men to build a massive causeway, a kilometer-long mole of stone and rubble, straight through the sea to the city walls. It was a siege ramp on a colossal, almost mythical scale, a direct echo of the earthen ramps used against Nineveh. While his engineers worked, he simultaneously deployed a fleet to blockade the city, demonstrating a masterful grasp of logistics and combined operations. When Tyre finally fell after 7 months, the message was as clear as it had been at Nineveh: no defensive position, no matter how natural or well fortified, was safe from human ingenuity. Alexander used such dramatic victories as psychological weapons, broadcasting his invincibility to future enemies and often convincing them to surrender without a fight. It was the Romans, however, who took this revolutionary thinking and forged it into an institutional doctrine of conquest. They systemized siege warfare to an unprecedented degree, embedding it into the very structure of their legions. Every Roman legion contained within it a corps of highly trained, dedicated military engineers, architects, and surveyors. These were not civilian specialists brought in for a single campaign. They were soldiers who built bridges, fortified camps every single night, and operated terrifying artillery pieces as a matter of routine. Their ballistae, giant crossbows that could fire heavy bolts with pinpoint accuracy, and their onagers, massive torsion-powered stone throwers, acted as ancient artillery barrages, softening up defenses and clearing walls before an assault even began. The Roman approach to a fortified city was a model of chilling efficiency. They would first build a fortified camp, then completely encircle the city with a circumvallation wall to prevent escapes or relief, and finally, they would methodically construct siege ramps and move their towers and rams into position. This process was relentless, predictable, and utterly devastating. It was the Nineveh principle refined, standardized, and scaled to an industrial level. The revolution born in the dust of a fallen Assyrian capital had now crossed continents and centuries, proving that the ideas tested in 612 BCE were not just a historical anecdote, but universally applicable truths of power. The Roman war machine, the most successful in the ancient world, was in many ways a direct descendant of that first, perfect storm of tactics that shattered the walls of Nineveh. For centuries, the great Assyrian capital existed only as a whisper in old texts, a name in biblical passages denoting a city of unimaginable sin and splendor. Then, in the 1840s, the whispers began to find a voice. A young British adventurer named Austin Henry Layard arrived at the great, mysterious mounds near Mosul, known locally as Kyanjik. He was not searching for treasure alone. He was driven by a belief that these earthen hills held a lost world. With a team of local workers, he began to dig, and the earth gave up its secrets. They did not find mere pottery shards or foundations. They broke through into the throne room of a king. The sprawling palace complexes of Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal emerged from the dust, their walls lined with alabaster. These were not blank stones. They were pages of a forgotten history book, carved in exquisite detail. The reliefs depicted everything from royal lion hunts to the precise logistics of moving colossal stone statues, offering a stunningly intimate look into the heart of the empire. But the most profound discovery lay in a chamber of the royal library. Here, Layard's team found a trove of thousands of clay tablets, each one inscribed with the precise wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script. This was the library of Ashurbanipal, a collection of the empire's knowledge gathered from across Mesopotamia. These were not just dry administrative records, they were epic poems like Gilgamesh, detailed medical texts, advanced mathematical calculations, and meticulous astronomical observations. They were the first-hand accounts of the Assyrians themselves, their thoughts, their beliefs, and their view of the world. Suddenly, Nineveh was no longer a myth. It was a real, breathing city with a documented history, and its stones began to tell its story. The carved reliefs on the palace walls became our most vital evidence. They show us in stunning visual detail the very engines of war that defined Assyrian power and which were later turned against them. We see illustrations of massive, wheeled siege towers rolling toward fortified cities, of disciplined soldiers using sophisticated battering rams, and of slingers and archers providing covering fire from elevated platforms. These are not artists' impressions, they are contemporary records of the military technology that forged an empire. The battlefield revolution was no longer just a theory deduced from ancient histories, it was a fact etched in stone and baked in clay. The archaeological resurrection of Nineveh provided the final, undeniable proof that the clash which shattered an empire was a documented, tangible event, whose lessons were literally carved into the walls for anyone with the patience to dig them up. The rubble of Nineveh's walls became a classroom for future generals. From the coalition's victory, a set of repeatable, logical principles emerged, crystallizing the chaotic art of siege warfare into a systematic science. The first and most fundamental of these was the absolute necessity of reconnaissance. Before a single battering ram was built, the Allies had to understand their target intimately. They needed to know which sections of the wall were weakest, where the water sources lay, and the daily rhythms of the guard patrols. This was not guesswork, it was a deliberate gathering of intelligence, turning the fortress from an impenetrable mystery into a structure with identifiable flaws. That intelligence then informed the second principle, complete isolation. The coalition did not just camp outside the walls, they actively severed Nineveh from the outside world, cutting its supply lines and blocking any hope of relief. This transformed the city's greatest strength, its self-sufficiency, into a ticking clock, creating a race against the dwindling morale and resources inside. The third principle was the triumph of patience over brute force. The initial, bloody failures at the gates taught them that valor alone was useless against stone. Victory required a sustained, multifaceted pressure that eroded the defenders' will as surely as it crumbled their ramparts. And finally, the siege proved the indispensable value of specialized engineering units. The sappers who dug the tunnels and the crews who operated the siege engines were not just soldiers with shovels. They were a new class of military professional, as vital to victory as the most skilled archer or spearman. These four ideas, reconnaissance, isolation, patience, and engineering, formed a new strategic blueprint. Attacking a fortress was no longer a test of courage, but a complex puzzle demanding multiple solutions applied in concert. Force alone could not win, but force combined with engineering, and engineering combined with psychological pressure, could achieve the impossible. Centuries later, Roman military writers like Vegetius would formally codify these very principles in their training manuals, making them standard curriculum for officers. The fall of Nineveh stands as a monumental case study, the moment military science decisively proved its superiority over raw, untamed power. Nineveh's fall is more than a story of ancient warfare. It is a universal parable of rigidity meeting innovation. The Assyrian Empire, for all its colossal power, ultimately crumbled not from a lack of strength, but from a fatal inability to adapt. Its leadership was imprisoned by its own glorious past, trusting in the same defensive doctrines and hierarchical command that had built its dominion. Yet the world around them had changed, and they failed to see it. They were defeated by rivals who studied their methods, learned from their weaknesses, and fused their own diverse talents into something new and unpredictable. This is the core of the metaphor, a lesson written in fire and stone that resonates far beyond the battlefield. What does it mean for any system, any organization, or even any person to become a victim of their own success? It means becoming so comfortable with the strategies that brought you victory that you stop questioning them. You build higher walls when you should be building more agile bridges. The Assyrians perfected the art of the fortress, but they could not conceive of an enemy who would simply refuse to play by the old rules of siegecraft. Their towering walls, both physical and mental, became their cage. In stark contrast, the Allied coalition embodied adaptability. They were not bound by a single tradition or a rigid chain of command. They were a network, not a pyramid. Their strength lay in their willingness to experiment, to combine Babylonian engineering with Median mobility and Scythian harassment, creating a hybrid form of warfare that its opponent could not comprehend. They looked at the same formidable walls and saw not a barrier but a complex problem to be solved with patience, psychology, and engineering. This dynamic is the heartbeat of resilience. It asks a profound question: are you building monuments to past victories, or are you building a mind capable of winning the next war? The echoes of Nineveh remind us that the landscape of challenge is always shifting. The very tools of your triumph can become the anchors of your downfall if you cling to them too tightly. For a nation, it might be an over-reliance on a single resource or industry. For a company, it could be a flagship product that blinds it to a disruptive new technology. For an individual, it might be a skill set that is rapidly becoming obsolete. The lesson is not to abandon what made you strong, but to never stop learning, evolving, and most importantly, collaborating. The Allies did not win because they were individually stronger than Assyria. They won because they were smarter together. They tear down the mental walls that said a Babylonian could not fight beside a Mede. In our own lives and endeavors, the ultimate fortress is not a static defense, but a dynamic, adaptable mind, forever willing to tear down its own assumptions and build anew. The principles that shattered Nineveh's walls did not vanish with the Assyrian Empire. They simply evolved, their core logic re-emerging in the steel and silicon of modern warfare. The coalition's combined arms approach, fusing infantry, cavalry, and skirmishers, finds its direct descendant in today's integrated battle networks. A contemporary military operation is a symphony of synchronized force, where satellite-guided airstrikes clear the path for advancing ground units, while naval assets launch cruise missiles from over the horizon. This is not a collection of separate services acting alone, but a single, unified system designed to overwhelm an enemy from every domain simultaneously, echoing the ancient fusion of Babylonian, Median, and Scythian strengths. Just as the Allies used whispers and visible diversity to erode Assyrian morale, modern conflict is dominated by psychological and information warfare. The relentless sonic pressure of the siege has been replaced by a digital onslaught, a constant stream of propaganda and disinformation broadcast across social media and television networks. Cyberattacks now target a nation's power grid and financial systems, aiming to create the same internal chaos and despair that the coalition sought to foster within Nineveh's walls. The objective remains identical: to break the enemy's will to fight before the first physical engagement even begins. And what of the invisible army of quartermasters and supply trains? The logistical genius that sustained the siege is now the backbone of global power projection. Forward operating bases in distant deserts are supplied by intricate aerial and ground convoys, a system far more complex but conceptually identical to the ox carts feeding the coalition army. Every drone in the sky, every guided munition, relies on a vast, unseen network of maintenance, fuel, and data links. Modern generals, like their ancient counterparts, understand a fundamental truth: an army is only as strong as its most distant supply depot. Even the very structure of the alliance that toppled Nineveh defines modern geopolitics. The multinational coalitions seen in recent decades are the direct political expression of that ancient military lesson. Nations with vastly different cultures and interests unite around a common strategic objective, pooling their unique military technologies and intelligence capabilities to confront a shared threat. This model of collective action, born from necessity on the plains of Mesopotamia, has become a standard instrument of international security. The siege of Nineveh stands as a primordial blueprint, proving that the most enduring elements of conflict are not the spears or the smart bombs, but the timeless interplay of innovation, logistics, and the human mind. The siege of Nineveh was far more than the destruction of a city. It was a crucible that forged a new paradigm of warfare, blending engineering, psychology, and coalition strategy into a devastatingly effective formula. We have journeyed from the peak of Assyrian power, through the innovative tactics that shattered its legendary walls, to the legacy that was eagerly adopted and refined by every empire that followed. This confrontation taught the ancient world a brutal but undeniable lesson: that adaptability and intellectual ingenuity will almost always triumph over sheer fortification and rigid tradition. The fall of Nineveh marked a revolution in thought, a shift from a contest of brute force to a complex intellectual puzzle. It proved that the most powerful weapon is not the sharpest spear, but the most creative mind, capable of seeing weakness where others saw only strength. This revolution that began on the dusty plains of Mesopotamia echoes unmistakably in the strategic doctrines of our own era. The principles of combined arms, information warfare, and global logistics are the direct descendants of that first perfect storm of tactics. The nature of conflict is ever evolving, but its foundational truths remain. As the historian Will Durant so eloquently noted, civilization is a stream with banks. The siege of Nineveh was one of those pivotal moments when the stream of human conflict dramatically and permanently changed its course, carving a new path that would shape the flow of history for millennia. If you found this journey into an ancient military revolution fascinating, share your thoughts in the comments below about which tactical innovation you find most impressive, and subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that shaped our world.